All right, with that, I think folks are starting to pile in pretty well at this point. So let's begin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of a new public initiative hosted by the U.S. Asia Institute, Northeast Asian Focus. For those who've attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the USAI, thank you for joining us. My name is Alec Bowman. I'm the Director of Programs Communications here at the U.S. Asia Institute. For a bit of a brief background, USAI is a nonpartisan, UN-recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This specific series will provide unique opportunities for the public to engage and engage with issues of importance to the region of Northeast Asia. So as Northeast Asia continues to be a region of economic, strategic, and political importance, gaining a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities that the region faces and areas for further U.S. engagement is paramount. Northeast Asian Focus targets congressional staff, U.S. executive branch officials, foreign diplomats, and members of the policy and business communities. So today's briefing will cover topics including the impacts of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict on Japan and South Korea, the important role of China, and predictions about the future South and North Korea relations. I'd like to get the briefing started with just a couple housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to give special thanks for the support of USAID's corporate stakeholders for helping make this program possible. This goes out to the SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, and Fairfield Maxwell. I'd also like to note that during the last 15 minutes or so of the briefing, there'll be time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question that you'd like our speakers to address, please type in the Q&A function anytime, or you can directly message me, Alec Bowman, if you prefer. If you're calling in by phone, you can email USAI@usasiainstitute.org with your question. Now, moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this discussion, Dr. Robert Sutter. Dr. Sutter is Professor of Practice and International Affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University, where he's also served as director of the school's main undergraduate program. A PhD graduate in history and East Asian languages from Harvard University, he has published 22 books, over 300 articles, and several hundred government reports dealing with contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries and the relations with the United States. In addition to his government career, his government career saw service as senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service, the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the U.S. government's National Intelligence Council, the China Division Director at the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You'll be able to read more about Dr. Sutter in our program found the chat function, which I will post in just a moment. We're very fortunate to have with him, us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Sutter, so you can introduce today's fellow panelists and continue this public briefing.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you today and work with the U.S. Asia Institute. I have a long-standing work with the Institute, and I welcome this opportunity to be with you today. And we have two really sterling commentators today, looking at the issues that we're going to address. And so, those of you that are tuning in, I think you're in from out of town, elsewhere. I think you're in for a very in-depth assessment of the Russia-Ukraine situation insofar as how it impacts Northeast Asian countries and Northeast Asian relations. And so we're going to look, and so first I'd like to introduce Tobias Harris. Tobias is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he oversees the national security and international policy team's work on Asia. From 2013 to 2021, he was a political risk analysis covering Japan and the Korean Peninsula at Tenno Intelligence, as well as a research fellow for economy, trade, and business at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA from 2014 to 2020. Prior to joining Tenno Intelligence, Harris worked for a Japanese legislator, authored a blog called Observing Japan, and conducted graduate research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and at the University of Tokyo. Next, I would like to welcome Sue Kim. Sue is a policy analyst at the Rayon Corporation and an adjunct instructor at American University. Her research interests include the Korean Peninsula, Russia, Indo-Pacific strategy, near-peer competition, decision-making, propaganda, and intelligence community. She served as an analyst at the CIA and also worked at the Department of Homeland Security. A native Korean speaker, Kim is a contributor to the Nikkei Asian Review and the Lowy Institute's interpreter, and has published articles in The Hill, The Diplomat, The National Interest, National Review, and other publications. And you can read more about our two speakers as well, looking at the chat function. Now on to today's briefing. I'm going to pass it over to Sue for her remarks, which will focus, I think, somewhat on, probably considerably on the Korean situation, and then followed by Tobias, who will focus, I think, more or less on the Japan situation. But this is all sort of open-ended, and we're going to have comments and questions from each other. And then I'll clean up this situation in offering some remarks about China. So Sue, would you please start?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Sutter, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to the U.S. Asia Institute for inviting me to speak on what I think is a very important topic. So when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, it's clear that the North Korea issue dominates the headlines thanks to Kim Jong-un's weapons development and the testing. Not to mention, they seem to have this strange, rather captivating hold of our attention. And I think this comes due to this largely isolated nature of the country, this outdated appearance of leader Kim Jong-un. We picture him in these baggy suits, the funny haircuts, and recently, he's sporting a bomber jacket, riding a white horse. It's a very bizarre scene. And also really the fact that the country is able to, or has been able to, withstand and resist the international community's gravitational pull towards political and economic reform and modernization. It's not what you would typically expect to see from a Western or democratic country in this day and age. Going back to the weapons issue, I think, perfect example is from the past couple of days, where we saw North Korea parade and flaunt its ICBMs, the hypersonics, SLBMs, to show to the rest of the world that there's no intent for North Korea to back down. If anything, their self-defensive deterrent could possibly turn into a preemptive weapon. So the fascination with North Korea, I think, generally tends to pique our interest. And I would also say that it works to Kim Jong-un's benefit. But what I'm most excited about today is that the discussion is going to focus refreshingly and I think necessarily so, less on North Korea and on Kim's nuclear gambit. And instead, we're looking at the incoming South Korean administration's perspective under Yoon Suk-yeol and what this leadership may portend in the way of Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. This is important not only because the Russia-Ukraine war has reaching implications beyond their bilateral relationship or even beyond Europe, but because this new crisis is challenging democracies and countries in the international order to think about their own roles and obligations to join other countries in their support for Ukraine and eventually to bring an end to the war. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to try to build granularity and context into South Korea's decision-making factors with respect to its response to the Russia-Ukraine war. And we'll see, of course, that the conventional factors, for instance, the US-South Korea alliance, the North Korean nuclear threat, South Korea's nuclear ambitions, international ambitions, still occupy significant space in their calculus. But it's much more complicated than simply signing on to multilateral efforts to call out and sanction Russia by virtue of our understanding of where South Korea is and its geopolitical state. But without further ado, we'll start with the current South Korean administration's response. So the Moon Jae-in administration. This administration, which is going to hand over the reins to its successor on 10th May, has been quite dilatory, I would say, in its response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Initially, the Moon government did not join US-led efforts to sanction Russia for its aggression, due mainly to its concerns about the economic ramifications. I would also add here that Moon may have been hesitant to get on board due to his sensitivities about how the North Korean regime would respond or observe South Korea's decision-making vis-a-vis Russia. He may also have been wary about China's watchful eye on its neighbors' behaviors regarding the conflict. So this is why Moon refrained from calling out Putin. He tried to remain on the sidelines and defer the tough decision-making to other countries. So rather than calling out Putin, he tried to dance around the issue. He referred to the sovereignty of Ukraine and basically just said that they needed to come to a peaceful resolution to the situation. And likewise, he did not immediately sign on to the multilateral sanctions on Russia either. South Korea signed on to the SWIFT sanctions eventually, but it did not pursue any bilateral sanctions itself. And earlier this month, we know that South Korea committed $30 million of aid, but that was also humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. But President Zelensky has asked South Korea for military aid, and Seoul does not appear to be leaning towards fulfilling this request. Zelensky has asked South Korea for armored vehicles, anti-tank, anti-ship, anti-aircraft weapons, and Seoul has been saying that it's reviewing the request, but the current government has indicated that sending weapons is not an option for the country. Saying that there are constraints to providing weapons, military and support, and troop deployment do not apply to us. I think that's what they said. So instead, the countries offered to send, I would also say they're important, but blankets, helmets, combat rations, purely on humanitarian grounds and not from the military angle. And now that we're nearing the end of the Moon administration and the transition between the two administrations are taking place, many of us, I think, are optimistic or even hopeful that the Yoon administration will be a departure from the Moon administration in many ways. And I think the president-elect, he's also created grounds for such optimism or high expectations from his new government. You may have read his foreign affairs piece, but he underscored the need for South Korea to really step up to the plate. And instead of making these half-hearted attempts to try to punch above its weight and to take on real responsibilities on the international stage. He's also mentioned that the current administration, its parochial and short-sighted conception of national interest has really hampered Korea from reaching greater potential and influence internationally. So he wants to expand the breadth of South Korea's diplomacy beyond just North Korea into the EU, into broader Asia, while of course maintaining the US alliance as the central axis of its foreign policy. So he appears to want South Korea to assume the full set of responsibilities of a country that's situated at the 10th largest economy in the world, what he has basically called the global pivotal state. And it sounds like a simple formula on matters concerning South Korea's core security interests. On North Korea, we know that the Yoon administration is going to pursue a harder line regarding the Kim regime's nuclear and missile ambitions. But broadly speaking, this means no negotiations summits without seeking concrete steps from North Korea to dismantle its nuclear arsenal, and also seeing some bona fide efforts from Kim to improve the situation on the peninsula, working towards lasting peace. This is also in line with the US position on denuclearization. And even on China, since the Yoon administration places premium on the alliance, we can expect the new South Korean government to seek a more, I would say, an equitable relationship with Beijing. Recently, Yoon said that he was aware that South Korea was economically dependent on trade with China. And he also said that this also applies to Beijing. And I thought this was interesting because it comes off as a rather harmless statement, just stating a fact underscoring that the two countries are tied economically. But I thought also veiled underneath the statement was a message to China that should Beijing try to pursue some sort of economic retaliation against Seoul, similar to the incident with the THAAD batteries, that Beijing will also have to bear some consequences. So he didn't have to spell it out, but I think the signals were there that this time around, South Korea will not just defer to China and basically tiptoe around Beijing, especially on matters concerning its own security. So the administration has expressed interest in participating in Quad member working groups also to counter China's rise. But these were very, not security, soft issues such as climate change or vaccine distribution. And it hasn't yet gone so far as to express interest in joining the Quad. The administration says it hasn't really received a formal request or an invitation from the United States to join. And this may actually be, I think, a needed respite for the administration, because even though there is an understanding that the South Korean government's foreign policy priorities will be a departure from that of the Moon administration, and as much as the Yoon administration harbors ambitions to carve out this distinct role on the international playing field, there's some hesitation, I think, to pivot to a very exclusive US-led security effort whose prime concern is Beijing. So for this step, it not only makes it clear that South Korea is more closely aligned with the United States than China, but it's actually taking an extra step to underscore what may be perceived as an anti-China position, which may incur consequences that Seoul may not be prepared to really face at this point. And I think a similar deliberation is running across the Yoon administration's position on Ukraine. What's clear is that the administration seems to perceive that it's no longer sufficient for Seoul to simply go through the motions of providing support for Ukraine, especially in light of Seoul's own history during the Korean War, its reputation as a model democracy. So the recognition is there, but it's unclear whether Yoon is going to able to actually boldly take that first step. I think one that's actually going to be uncomfortable at first, to truly support Ukraine, the resistance on the battlefield and not just on the sidelines. And I would think that in light of the administration's clear prioritization of the alliance and its foreign policy, that the concerns of Chinese or Russian political retaliation figure less in its deliberations than the more palpable economic ramifications. And against this backdrop of the supply chain shortages around the world, we're also talking about more modest economic growths around different countries, the evolving situation with the pandemic, the concerns from the Yoon administration about the economy I think they're valid, but just as China has weaponized the economic dependence of its trade partners, it's possible that Russia may try to do the same towards South Korea. And we should note that the Yoon administration has expressed willingness to stand up to China. So what happens if it expresses the same willingness to Russia? I think the key here is supply chain resilience. And this is, of course, an area of concern for all countries right now, which is precisely why the United States is seeking more commitment from allies and trying to strengthen partnerships around the world. And I think it's also precisely why Seoul needs to reduce its dependence on China and Russia. So I'd like to close by saying that the prospects for South Korea's expanded role in the international stage are probably going to fare better under the Yoon administration, but we'll have to see how he actually commits his words into action, not just on the Ukraine issue, but other areas where the United States would like to see a little more commitment, unequivocal support from South Korea. And I'd also note that critical to driving a more proactive commitment from Seoul is the domestic political environment. If Yoon were to face constraints and challenges, COVID-19 is going to be an example, or even the upcoming legislative elections, he may not have the sufficient political capital to pursue some of these more ambitious goals on the foreign policy field. So I think that covers the broad basis for today's discussion, and I look forward to the moderated session and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Great. An excellent foundation. Thank you so much for a very comprehensive review. I think we'll now turn to Tobias and get his insights on the issues from his perspective. So please.
Thank you, Dr. Sutter. Thanks for the introduction.
Can I ask everybody to call me Bob, if you don't mind?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, Bob. Thank you
This is the
also.
Capitol Hill venue, and then nobody goes by doctor.
Okay, well,
Right.
I can do that. And thank you to the U.S. Asia Institute for hosting this. Really have enjoyed these briefings in the past, and so really happy to do it again. So I will do something similar for Japan. And actually, I really actually appreciated how Sue framed South Korea in terms of its global ambitions, because there's a natural kind of compare and contrast with Japan on that score, where Japan, by virtue of being a member of the G7, of course, a larger economy than Korea, has much greater ambitions in terms of being a pillar of international society. And I think we can really compare how Japan reacted to Russia's actions in 2014 and how it's reacted this time to really show what the Abe administration did as far as expectations for Japan's role in the world, and that it really raised the bar in terms of what the Japanese government is expected to do in response to a global crisis. I mean, and Abe, frankly, did not handle 2014 well, but we saw progressively as Japan took leadership roles in all sorts of different ways that I think other countries, particularly the United States, but also partners in Europe and elsewhere in the region, are now increasingly looking for Japan to not sit on the sideline, to not be a follower in terms of a crisis, but to really be involved in the central deliberations as part of a crisis. And we saw that during the months leading up to Russia's invasion, where the United States and Japan, I think, were communicating quite closely and frequently in terms of how they would respond. And we really have seen quite an extensive, impressive response from the Kishida government to Russia's invasion. And it's a really long list. I mean, before, as I prepared my remarks for this, I looked at the running tally that the Japanese government is keeping. It is a very long list. And I actually wrote a report on both how Japan and South Korea might contribute to international efforts that came out right before the invasion started. And I soft pedaled my recommendations a bit because I still thought, well, I think they're going to do more, but there's still going to be reasons why they hold back. And that has not been the case. I mean, Japan has fully participated in G7 sanctions as far as Russia is concerned, both financial sanctions and trade sanctions. It has provided a really impressive array of support to Ukraine, including non-lethal military assistance, which is really a new thing for Japan, providing bulletproof vests and helmets, uniforms. It has allowed Ukrainian refugees into Japan, not in substantial numbers, but has certainly made clear that it's going to welcome Ukrainian refugees, which, again, if you know Japan's general response to allowing refugees in, it has not always been the case. It's expelled Russian diplomats. And, so all of this shows that I think Japan recognizes that this was a moment that it really had to step up. A major theme of its diplomacy over the past decade has really been a commitment to upholding a rules-based international order and sort of recognizing that Japan has to be part of that. And so I think they've committed, in a number of practical ways, to following up on that rhetoric. So what I want to do with the remainder of my time is talk about sort of what some of the consequences have been. And I want to go from short term to longer term in terms of thinking about what the Ukraine war might actually mean as far as Japan is concerned. So the most immediate short term consequence, I mean, and of course this has long term aspects, has basically been an end to a decade of attempted diplomatic reconciliation with Russia. And this began during the Abe years, and really the guiding strategic impetus as far as former Prime Minister Abe's approach to Russia was a desire, or sort of a recognition that if Japan could find a way to resolve its longstanding territorial dispute with Russia and finally conclude a peace treaty that would formally end the Second World War with Russia, then it might at least reduce tensions on Japan's northern flank and allow Japan to focus more on its difficult security relationship with China and redirect some of its military assets to the southwest, where of course you have territorial dispute with China and a lot of concerns about the military balance around Taiwan. That really was the guiding spirit of Abe's Russia policy, and it really resulted in quite a sustained effort by Abe. A number of meetings with Putin. He overturned decades of the approach that Japan took to Russia, where it was not going to pursue economic cooperation with Russia until there was progress on the territorial front. Abe said, no, we'll do economic cooperation in the Russian Far East, and hopefully that will build a spirit of trust that will allow progress on the territorial dispute. Basically, as a result of this conflict, all of that has stopped. That we are now back to a situation, certainly relations between Japan and Russia are now probably as bad as they've been since the end of the Cold War. Russia is now referring to Japan as throwing in its lot with the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. I mean, you've had rhetorical blasts back and forth. Russia is now going to expel Japanese diplomats. And basically both sides have said that there can be no negotiations about the territorial settlement as long as as long as relations are in this condition. Japan has basically forbid any new investment in Russia. You basically now have a deep freeze between Japan and Russia that's going to continue for the indefinite future. So that's a pretty big change. It's going to force Japan to really do some thinking about how it views Russia as far when it's thinking about its national security environment and what sort of threats it faces. And so that's going to have some pretty significant implications going forward, and I'll get into those in a little bit. The second consequence that we can see is economic turbulence, and I think the main symptom of that has been the yen is now at its lowest level in ages compared to the dollar and the euro, and that really has resulted in cost push inflation at home, because all of the commodities, particularly energy, but also food, some other things that Japan imports, all of those things have gotten more expensive as a result of the implications of the war. Japan is now paying more for all of those things, and it is having a real impact on small businesses, in particular on Japanese households. And this is all more complicated by the fact that you have the Bank of Japan is still committed to some of its unconventional monetary policies. It is not committed to raising rates in line, interest rates in line with the Fed and the European Central Bank and some other central banks. And so you have these sort of structural factors that are going to continue to weaken the yen and force Japan to pay more for the commodities that it imports. So there's not really an end in sight. And this is a real headache, I think, for the Kishida government. And just yesterday, Prime Minister Kishida gave a press conference and announced a new set of fiscal measures to try to help households and businesses deal with this turbulence. Is it going to throw Japan's growth off completely? That's a little unclear. But it is going to be a real irritant going forward, and something that the government's going to have to continue to deal with. Related to that, and this is really getting to some of the longer term consequences, we really have to look at the impact on Japan's energy mix. And Japan, of course, imports a great deal of natural gas and oil, and Russia, not a major supplier, but has been part of prior to the war, was certainly part of Japan's efforts to diversify away from Middle Eastern sources. Now they're going to have to think about whether Russia's too great of a risk, and certainly we're not going to, there's not going to be a lot of rush to invest in joint Russia-Japan or multinational energy projects in the Russian Far East, where we have seen some of those projects before. Japan hasn't pulled out of those projects yet, but there was a lot of hope, not just for new fossil fuel projects, but also Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and its Russian counterpart last year had signed an MOU that basically pointed to Russia as important as a source for renewables and clean hydrogen in the future. All of that is in question now. The idea that Russia was going to help Japan deal with its ambitions to decarbonize its energy sources, that's over. at least for the time being, we can't see that. We're not going to see that happening. And so Japan's really going to have to think about where it's getting its energy from. It might completely change the debate about nuclear power in Japan, which has really been in a holding pattern for a very long time. And I think there's been some efforts now to realize that Japan really needs to think about both clean energy and also energy security, and nuclear might be the answer to that. And so I think we're going to start seeing a little more effort to get those offline nuclear reactors back online. The final area, and this really could potentially be the most important for the region. The war in Ukraine, I think it is safe to say, has really been a wake-up call both for Japanese elites and the Japanese public about the potential really for war in East Asia. And of course, that means that attention is on China and Taiwan, and really has, I think, concentrated minds about what war could look like. Awareness that it would be virtually impossible for Japan to not be drawn into a conflict with surrounding Taiwan, given its role hosting U.S. forces, given the proximity of some of its outlying islands to Taiwan. And I think you have Japanese elites really starting to think very carefully about what Japan needs to do to prepare for conflict so as not to be caught off guard, what its defense footprint needs to look like. This year was already going to be, I think, a momentous year for Japan's defense policy. The Kishida government had already indicated that it was going to revise Japan's national security strategy for the first time since 2013. It was going to put out a new national defense program guidelines, which sort of more specific defense strategy, and also a midterm defense spending program. All of those reviews will now be conducted within the shadow of the war of Ukraine, and this recognition that it is not unthinkable that Japan could be brought into war, and people need to start really thinking about how to prepare both the public and Japan's military for that eventual or that potential contingency. And so you have, I think, a shift in public opinion as far as defense spending is concerned. Just this past week, there was a Nikkei Shimbun poll that I think for the first time ever showed a majority in favor of increasing defense spending, and really, and not just increasing it by a small amount. It actually asked whether people supported a proposal the LDP has considered to raise Japan's defense spending to 2% of GDP, which would basically be doubling Japan's defense spending. So the public is actually now in favor of that. There might actually be support for Japan acquiring capabilities that would allow it to strike targets in foreign countries. That would be a major shift in defense doctrine. There's just a real opening now, I think, for defense hawks in Japan to convince the public that Japan really needs to take its national security and regional security a lot more seriously. And if Japan were to follow through on some of the proposals that are being mooted right now, it really would change, I think, what the region looks like. And so I think it is absolutely something for us all to keep an eye on in Washington, and really watch as the potential for a new consensus on defense shifts. I'm going to stop there and hand it back over to you, Bob.
Thanks very much. So folks, we really have, so folks, we really have a good grounding on Korea and on Japan. And I'm going to try to offer some remarks on China, which are related to these developments. It probably won't be as comprehensive as theirs, but I think it's relevant to what's going on in Congress and what's going on in the debate in the United States, such as it is discussion in the United States about policy toward China. And as we know, the dynamics of Northeast Asia, like the rest of the Indo-Pacific region, have been dominated by this acute U.S. rivalry with China during the past 5 years. And in this period of time, Congress has been instrumental in hardening American resolve to counter wide-ranging challenges posed by China in 3 sets of issues. Those of you that are in Congress and have some interest in this, this is the period where Congress has been more influential on China policy than at any other time in American history. What's taken place in Capitol Hill in dealing with China since 2018 has been remarkable, and it's sustaining. It's not changing. It's continuing. And so Congress really has set the pace in this thing. And what are the three challenges? And this is a putting together of all the issues that we have with China in some way that easier to convey the information. The first set of issues deal with Chinese expansionism at others' expense, seeking to change the regional balance of power and achieve Chinese dominance in the Asia-Pacific region. That set of concerns is very important for Congress and very important in existing US policy now. And this has been going on for 4 years. Second, China's predatory state-directed economic practices, seeking economic dominance at others' expense, notably in high technology industry. And so this is the second cluster of issues that are challenging the United States and that Congress and the administration, both in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, have been working to counter. And the third is Chinese support for global governance, legitimating its expansionism and its predatory economic practices, seeking dominance in the New World Order led by authoritarian and often corrupt powers, notably Vladimir Putin's Russia, seeking dominance in their respective spheres of influence. So this governance mode of China and the way that the Chinese government, the way it carries it out, is one that it works closely with Mr. Putin and works closely with others, but particularly Mr. Putin. I think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have met 38 times. They've spent more time with each other than any other couple of international leaders. And so, and I don't think they talk about flowers or coin collections. I think they talk about hard stuff. And so what we find in the Chinese behavior in reaction to the war in Ukraine is that it supported Russia diplomatically and economically within the confines of actions avoiding major sanctions on China. But it's very active in the areas where it's supporting them. And this is particularly true internationally and with considerable success. Beijing has worked to dissuade governments in the Asia-Pacific and other world areas to avoid support for or to counter US-led sanctions targeting Russia. Sue has already alluded to the South Korean government's wariness of alienating China by taking a tougher stance toward Russia. Beijing depicts US-led NATO expansion as the underlying cause of the war, and it condemns the US-led supplying of the Ukrainian forces with needed military equipment and other supplies. So it's against that. So it takes a very strong position. It doesn't fully, it very much aligns with Russian interest in this regard. Chinese lobbying has had little success in this effort in Europe. European countries have been turned off by this Chinese effort to basically be apologetic for what Putin's been doing in Ukraine, and among other Western aligned countries in other regions. And in the Indo-Pacific, notable here is Japan and Australia. In many cases, the Chinese approach has deepened the resolve of governments in Japan and Australia and these governments in Europe to join the US in countering the Chinese challenges. So that's an impact. But the impact on South Korea is maybe it's significant. The fact that the South Koreans are hesitating in doing this sort of thing. And maybe that will change somewhat with the new government coming in Korea. South Korea, we can talk about that in a minute. Elsewhere, but this is important. Elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia, Chinese lobbying has added to reasons why these countries stand on the sidelines and avoid taking sides in the Ukraine war that would antagonize and risk punishment by China. And so against this background, what I see are two important clarifications that have come about. As you'll see, this is not really good news for the United States, but it's important news. And it's something that fits in well, I think, with what Congress is doing on China. The first one is that there have been lots of specialists over the years who have long argued that the Russia-China entente was mainly an axis of convenience, with a weak foundation, giving the United States the option when it wants to manipulate and maneuver between the mutually suspicious powers. I think this is shown to be incorrect. What we now see what we now see vividly because of the Ukraine war is an alignment, a close alignment, an axis of authoritarians. And now this specialists have been looking at this issue for some time. And 4 years ago, we had a big project at the National Bureau of Asian Research, which I led, and we did many publications, but we did a book called Axis of Authoritarians. And we called it then. And that's what the specialists, there were over 100 specialists were involved in this, and that's what they agreed on. But it didn't sink in too well. But now it's sinking in. The depth of their relationship between the Russian leaders and the Chinese leaders is strong. Russian dependence on China is ever stronger because of the sanctions resulting from the Ukraine war. And China is deeply committed to sustaining Russia as a very useful and leading partner in Beijing's efforts to distract and undermine US power, standing in the way of China's headlong pursuit of power and influence, seeking regional and global leadership. They're together on this. And so, and I think this illustrates, what we're seeing illustrates this pretty well. Second, that's not really good news for us. The second point here, with notable exceptions, and that is the case Japan and Australia, the governments of the Asia Pacific are not on the side of the United States and its NATO allies as they confront Russia over the war in Ukraine. A major part of the reason for this, there are many reasons, but the major part of the reason for this is China's influence. And in Southeast Asia in particular, China's power and influence has reached a point where the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and its member states carefully avoid positions or statements at odds with Chinese interests. When this sort of thing happens, it's very rare. And why don't they do it? Because China will punish them. And so they don't do it. It's not in their interest at this point. Do they worry about being dominated by China and being put into a sphere of influence by China? Sure, but they're not prepared to do much about it at this point. In contrast, these officials are very active in pointing out all sorts of shortcomings by the United States in various areas. I guess the US won't punish them. I think that's probably the counter argument. But on balance, what you see, because of the decline of US influence in Southeast Asia, gone are the days when America was considered the leading power, outside power in Southeast Asia. It has been displaced by China as the region's leading economic, security, and diplomatic power. So what do these two things mean? Well, they're clarifications. And it shows that the United States faces big challenges, that they have to know how to deal with Russia and China at the same time. And in addition, they find that their situation in dealing with China is compromised to a considerable degree because China's influence in the region is growing a lot. And in Southeast Asia, it's outpaced the United States for sure. And so this is a big problem for the United States as well. And so what is the outcome of all this? Well, number one, it shows that the members of Congress have been very clear-eyed on how they look at China. They're not naive in this regard. And it shows that that approach is correct, that this needs to be continued and strengthened. And America has to work on domestic strengthening, building its better relationships with alliances, with allies and partners in dealing with the situation. But the task is not easy. The task is difficult. And it needs a long-term effort. And here Congress is really good at countering specific challenges. It can pass a piece of legislation on this, pass it on that. It's not really good at coming up with a strategy, an overall approach that we need to use in order to deal with these very serious problems that I've just tried to lay out. And that's really up to the administration. The president is the lead in foreign policy, according to the Constitution. And so that's what he should be doing. And I think Biden is trying to do that. And Trump had a strategy. And so what's needed is an effective strategy. And so I think we have a bipartisan cooperation in Congress on these issues. I think we have close cooperation with the administration as they take their positions on these issues. But what's needed is an effective approach, and that hasn't been laid out yet. And it's coming, I guess. Pieces of it are evident, but we really need that. And of course, the Ukraine war has just illustrated the dangerous situation that we're in. So I'm going to stop there now, and I think oh goodness, we have time for questions comments among ourselves, folks. Sue or Tobias, do you have a comment or question you'd like to raise? I have one or two about yours, but let's get the ball rolling here. Anybody? Either one?
So I was just thinking, and I'm probably stating the obvious, but it's interesting that this war is between Russia and Ukraine, but it seems like the decision-making factors for, again, I'm talking, I think, specifically about South Korea, is of course about Russia's retaliation, but there's this central pervasive China factor that doesn't seem to go away. So it's really ironic that the war is taking place in Europe,
right,
but the decision-making, the biggest factor seems to be the bigger country that's in the region.
Right. And I agree. I mean, the U.S. approach, don't you think the U.S. approach is, U.S. government approach is well aware that China is the main danger. The idea that Russia would dominate America is pretty remote, but the fear of domination by China, I think, is quite strong. High technology, and of course, if they dominate Asia, they could be a fundamental threat to the United States. And so these critical concerns. I mean, Mr. Biden said we're in the fourth industrial revolution, and if China wins, we're sunk. And so I think this is a very common sort of view. Yeah, so it's hard to get away from that.
Yeah, I think the other thing, and I maybe alluded to this, but could have made it more clear, is that I think certainly in Japan too, I think the thing that they are finding eye-opening is the role nuclear deterrence has played in all of this, and watching how, the U.S. has been questions about Russia deterring the U.S. from being involved in other ways, and I think Japanese elites have been watching very closely. But again, it's then naturally they jump to back to Asia, and they look at China's attempts to strengthen its nuclear arsenal, and they think, well, if this of course Ukraine not being a NATO not actually being a member of NATO, having sometimes I find myself reminding Japanese officials and intellectuals who I talk to that it's not a perfect analogy, but I think they are they see the reluctance of the United States to take step, to really escalate in any way that might involve the use of nuclear weapons. And they wonder, well, ostensibly we're under a U.S. nuclear umbrella. If as China's arsenal gets better, what is that going to mean for us? And what do we need? Are there things that we need to do? You have a discussion now, maybe Japan needs to change its non-nuclear principles, or at least modify them and allow the U.S. to have nuclear weapons directly in Japan. That piece of it has not been overlooked, even in a place like Japan, where they're not used to really thinking, I think, in detail about nuclear strategy, and that is lurking around, I think, as a question that's going to come out of this.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Tobias. The Japanese worry about nuclear deterrence. I mean, you think they'd want Biden to do a tit for tat when Putin says, well, we're going to think about nuclear weapons? You think the Japanese would have been reassured if the United States had done the same thing? I mean, I don't think so. But,
no, that's what I always wonder, because it's always they always leave it a little unclear what they want. It's like, well, we think the U.S. is too reluctant, to show its willingness to use nuclear weapons. Well, on the other hand, do you really want them
Right.
you really want nuclear saber rattling either. I mean, like let's think through the full implications of this. But I mean, I just think there is some, I think they, we talk a lot about Japan's nuclear allergy, but I think they're afraid that there's a U.S. nuclear allergy that could mean that, in a crisis, the U.S. is reluctant to fully defend Japan, and that I just, I think previously unvoiced thoughts have, I think, become a lot more explicit as a result of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, yeah. And Sue, I wanted to ask you and Tobias, you didn't talk about Korea and Japan, South Korea and Japan working together. And that's been sort of a third rail in the Moon government. I mean, it's really been hard to do, and yet that's what the U.S. really wants. It seems to me, among of the priorities of the United States in dealing with the situation in Asia, a close relationship among the three of them, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, would be important. And the U.S. And the South Korea-Japan friction has been a real problem. And so, what's the prospect of that? Because I think Mr. Yoon has made some gestures. I think he said the comfort woman deal should be recognized, and that seemed to put that issue aside. But anyway, I wonder if you could to speculate at least, or probably have more than speculation backing your comments on the relation, and the Japan side too, willing to work with South Korea.
I'll defer to Sue first, and then I'll chip in. But why don't you go first?
Sure. I think the most excited countries right now, because of Yoon's election victory, is of course the United States, and I think also Japan as well, because I think his campaign statements were sort of mixed in that he was indicating that he'd be open to improving relations. But then the history matter seems to have sort of like trailed behind him, because there wasn't a really clear position as to what he wanted to do. But now that he's gearing up to actually become president, and he's installing people in his cabinet, there have been steps even before he's becoming president to show that he's really serious about improving relations with Japan. And again, I think this goes back to what he said about the United States alliance, but how he needs to, he wants this to be basically the central focus of South Korea's foreign policy. And if you're trying to build and strengthen relations with the United States in this day and age, against the backdrop of the war, China's aggression, then you have to include the Japan component. And he seems to recognize that, because it's beneficial for South Korea to not just linger with history, and to move forward and to show not just to China, but also to North Korea, that the three countries are going to be working together. But again, I think one, caution that we have to be mindful of is that there's also going to be a domestic component. And it could possibly be that someone from the opposition would try to stir things up about South Korea's tensions with Japan. It's not just the comfort women issue, but there's Takashima and Dokdo issue. So many things I could just pull from history or from current events, and it could be spun up. And he's going to have to figure out a way to address it in a way that it pleases the public, but it also keeps Korea and Japan relations, on forward movement, I would say.
Great. And Tobias, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I of course, I think things are looking better than they have in a long time, and it's the last few years have been about as bad as Japan's relationship with South Korea has been ever, certainly post 1945. But the problem is, we saw there was a delegation that Yoon sent to Japan this week. They met with Prime Minister Kishida. The problem is that I think Japan is now in this position where it has staked out a maximalist position as far as history issues are concerned, and have not left. I mean, certainly they left the Moon government very, very little room to maneuver. And even for Yoon, who has emphasized the importance of getting relations with Japan right, even he is going to be in something of a tricky situation, because Japan is has made very clear that essentially it needs a commitment from the South Korean government that the 1965 Basic Treaty is inviolable. That South Korea, surrendered all rights to make claims against Japanese companies and the Japanese government in that treaty. And so that, basically all these court cases against Japanese companies that, were accused of using labor conscripts from Korea during pre-1945, that those cases are illegitimate because South Korea gave up all those claims. It's not exactly clear what Japan wanted as far as the South Korean government in terms of quashing private lawsuits, but that's been sort of the fundamental position, and so they basically want the South Korean government to cave on this issue, to give up and say, you're right, 1965 is inviolable. That is the basis for all relations going forward, and then we'll try to build a relationship of trust based on that. And I mean, there hasn't really been a clear signal from Yoon as far as, is he going to give the Japanese government what they want? But it is very clear that the Japanese government is not going to go first. That they're not going to meet halfway. They want the South Korean government to make the first move, and then Japan will make an assessment and figure out how they're going to handle it. And so, I think there's an agreement between the two governments that they do have shared interests. They're certainly better aligned on China than Moon was with the Japanese government. But despite having those shared interests, and I should also say, I think maybe are more in line on North Korea as well. Despite having those shared interests, that I still think any path forward is going to, as far as the Japanese government is concerned, is going to depend on Yoon really offering some clear message that satisfies just the kind of rhetoric and the kind of commitment, to not question the legal basis for the bilateral relationship, and then we'll see what happens going forward.
Great. I have a couple more questions. I'm really Mr. Kishida is somebody that I'm really interested in watching this guy and how the South Koreans are going to react to him. But I think we should get into questions from the audience at this point. And I'm not sure how Alex wants to handle this. He sent me something in the chat. Alex, I think it'd be better if you would read the questions. I think because it's I hesitate to try to read it carefully here. So if you could do it, that would help, I think, in this situation. So just choose the questions, and folks, if you have questions, directed at whomever is the one that should answer it. That would be very helpful as well. So Alex, would you start that?
Of course. Our first question comes from Christopher Woody. This is directed towards Tobias. What do you think heightened tensions with Russia, or what do you think heightened tensions with Russia will mean for how Japan divides its military focus and resources? Would have to maintain the same level of attention to its northern and southern approaches.
That is, I mean, it is one of the key questions right now that, as Japan conducts this big strategic review over the course of the year, that they're going to have to answer, because of course the thrust for the last decade or so has been, we can't do what we did during the Cold War, where we had sort of this equal distribution of forces along the archipelago, and a really strong presence in northern Honshu and Hokkaido. And of course the focus has been on flexibility, mobility, jointness, the concentration on defending the southwestern islands and preparing for contingencies with China. I think clearly they might have to rethink that approach, and there might have to be at least more than a residual force or concentration of forces in the north, and certainly think about too. I mean, we've seen lots of joint exercises between Japan or between Russia and China. I think they're going to be thinking about that. That if there was some sort of situation in the East China Sea, would you have to deal with Russia maybe not directly involved, but maybe providing some sort of distraction, or I think they're going to have to really think very, very seriously about whether there are going to have to be some changes that reflect a worsening strategic situation as far as Russia is concerned. So I don't think there's an answer to that yet, but it's definitely something they're going to have to look at.
Thank you for that, Tobias. We have one more question that just came through. This one comes from Orjul Babul. Hi, Orjul. it's a larger overarching question and probably more subject to some of your own thoughts here rather than any truth to what people might believe. But does the Korean or Japanese government support the current administration, I believe the United States, strategy in Ukraine, or do you think an off-ramp strategy should be pursued? This will be probably posed towards the entire panel if there's anyone who'd like to jump in first.
I could take a stab. I think,
Of course.
I mean, how the Moon administration views the approach, I think, is vastly different from the Yoon administration. As I said, they're much more cautious, and you go back to some of the commentaries and the statements that they've been making in the lead up to the war, and also in the first few days. It's very much focused on national interests, and I found it kind of surprising that they would be able to be so vocal about national interests, even if it matters to them, while other countries around the world are sort of, they're of course there's national interest in their calculus, but you don't expressly state it to the public, where the public is not just your domestic audience, but other countries, i.e. Ukraine, United States. So that was a little bit astounding, and they kept emphasizing economic interests. So you could tell that that was a very conscious decision, and that was the biggest, I guess, stumbling block and concern that they had. I would think that the Yoon administration is supporting what the Biden administration is doing, but again, supporting it vocally or verbally, and actually carrying out the support in such a way that you're actually physically providing assistance, not just in these, for lack of a better word, wishy-washy way where you're basically waiting for other countries to prompt you to make that decision, is very different from the taking the initiative and making gestures that are not just symbolic, but actually place, I think, South Korea on that commitment path. And the decision that it makes for Ukraine, I think, is going to set the stage for Seoul's other more important obligations and roles in the future as well.
Thank you for that, Sue. Tobias, if you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we're thinking about kind of national interest, I mean, I think Japan's approach has been, staying in step with the United States and Europe, other G7 countries, is an interest in its own right. I mean, and in some ways, I don't think Japan necessarily has a vision for of its own for an end game, or what how to end this. And so I think making sure that it's on the same page with G7 countries, and then also just making sure that you're just trying to prevent Russia from being rewarded or benefiting from engaging in a war of aggression like this, and I making sure that sort of a norm against this kind of thing happening, that is also a Japanese national interest. And so I think as a result, I mean, I think we'll just see kind of a continuation of what we've seen, efforts to make sure that Japan is working with its partners and supporting Ukraine, and trying to make sure that Russia is paying a price for having launched this war. And so I suspect that's what we'll continue to see as far as Japan is concerned.
Just briefly on the China, thank you. Just briefly on the China side, I haven't seen any recent reaction to the recent disclosure of Mr. Austin, Secretary Austin's remarks about the U.S. working to make sure that Russia doesn't have the capacity in the future to do these kinds of things like they're doing in Ukraine. And that's quite serious, and that's not really looking for an off-ramp, it seems to me. It's a very different type of posture. It's an escalation in a way, and I think China will see it as an escalation. How they'll react is quite interesting to watch, because China is always trying to be in the right position, and that protects its interest. It will continue to support Russia for sure. But the American resolve, and this resolve, I assume, is backed by the European NATO countries, is remarkable, and it's not looking for an off-ramp right away. it's looking for something else, and I think the idea of working with Putin to work something out, I think is seen as been put aside for the time being. And so that just seems to be the situation we're in. And so I think off ramps are always a good idea, but I just, right now, I think it's just not we're moving in a different direction than off ramps right now, it seems to me.
Thanks for that, Bob, and for the entire panel's comments on that question. I realize now that we're past 11 a.m. It's 11:06 now, and no further questions have come in at this point. So with that, Bob, I was wondering if it'd be appropriate for me to carry the torch for the duration of the briefing and start to wrap things up.
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Should I? I'm sorry, but what should I do now? Hand it over to you, or you hand it over to me? I'll hand it over. Okay, if you want me to finish, I'll do it. What I'm struck by, folks, is a couple of other things that we didn't get a chance to address. Mr. Kishida has been so active in the region as a security leader. He did 2+2 talk. His government did 2+2 talks with the Philippines. They're going to talk about some sort of deployment there. I mean, it's really remarkable. And then of course he went to India, and he went to Cambodia, and Cambodia came out against Russia. But that's probably Hun Sen's orientation rather than Japan. But the Japanese have been very active in their diplomacy in support of the NATO approach in dealing with Ukraine. So it's a remarkable change, in addition to the other things that have been mentioned. And so I was very struck by that. And I think China really doesn't like that one bit. And so so China faces challenges by countries like Japan and Australia and others, even though they have this strong influence in the region. But I think what we're seeing, folks, is a very broad, sort of comprehensive, I think, analysis of the different considerations when you think about Korea, you think about Japan, and we've had some China's multifaceted considerations have not been addressed, but the implications of what's happened has been addressed. And I think the questions have been really good. So I think we should feel that we've accomplished a good thing today. And I thank the Institute for this opportunity to participate. So I think we will conclude on that note.
Thank you, Bob. Of course, USAI greatly appreciates you stepping in to moderate and also providing your great perspective to everything that was discussed today. Leading the discussion was both impressive, and it was fascinating to listen to you, as well as Sue and Tobias, who also provided their excellent insight and the perspective on all these issues. So we were honored to host all of you, and we really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your busy schedules to be here today. And I'm sure that everyone who's tuning in today really appreciates it as well. Though we're out of time, we present the opportunity for those tuning in with interest in U.S.-Asia relations to reach out to the U.S.-Asia Institute, if they have questions relevant to our future events, for this public webinar series. So if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us at USAI@USAsiaInstitute.org. We'd be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues we discussed today. For congressional staff in our audience tuning in today, those interested in Northeast Asia relations, USAI is beginning its Korea 101 Congressional Briefing Series in early May. And this series will provide unique insight into the U.S.-Korea relationship and issues on the Korean Peninsula through expert analysis. So interested congressional staff will have the opportunity to engage directly with U.S.-Korea experts in an off-the-record setting, with invitations for each session being sent out weekly. So if you'd also like to contact me directly to RSVP for that, my email is alec.bowman@usasiainstitute.org. So please feel free. With that, folks, I'm going to say thank you once more, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.